Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We're thrilled that you were able to attend today and to join us. We're excited that we have Sharon Friesen and Peter Barron here to focus on creating optimal learning conditions for all students through implementation of the professional practice standards. Oops, sorry. As a provincial organization, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory, gathering grounds, meeting place, and traveling route of the peoples of Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. I acknowledge the lands that are depicted in this image of Pigeon Lake, where I reside for part of the year. Pigeon Lake is home of the four nations of Meskwachí, Ermineskin Cree Nation, Sampson Cree Nation, Montana First Nation, and Louisville Bull Tribe. Gratitude to many Indigenous peoples of the past whose footsteps have shaped this land, and those of the present and future who will continue to shape it for centuries to come. I acknowledge the richness of Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing, and that there are many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who I share space with, and that I will continue to educate myself on this shared history, good and bad, in an effort to aid reconciliation efforts and continue my lifelong journey in this area. As a result of participating in this webinar, you will have the opportunity to develop an awareness and understanding of themes from the research findings, learn how one school authority addresses various themes, and imagine approaches that are most appropriate for your own context and role, creating the conditions for optimum learning for all. The image on the left-hand side of the screen was an image that we developed at CAS when some of the initial work on the professional practice standards was created by some of our implementation supports. And we designed that image to show the through line between the leadership quality standard, superintendent quality standard, and teaching quality standard. And those images are free to use in your own way in your school authority. If you need access to them, please let me know. I appreciate how Santiago Rincon Gallardo circled the green part of the image that really shows the result and the outcome of the professional practice standards and the work that we do as system education leaders to support optimum learning for all. This session is specific about two areas of practice: qualitative finding. The research report from the compilation of the university's post-secondary groups from across the province is a fantastic read. And one of the findings in that document, a couple of the findings, talk about implementation of competency 5 was identified as a challenge and an area for continued growth. Another theme from the research was about implementation. And we've done some work in that area at CAS around that implementation matters, and we'll get into that later in the webinar. In this case, some of the findings from the final research report are identified as implementation. Professional learning was an intervention or a focus of the report that needed to occur for the professional practices to be implemented. A strong theme that came through was how we measure impact, not just providing professional learning or focused on implementation, but how do we know if our practices are having an effect? And then the other theme was that the Indigenous learning area was a competency that needed to continue to be focused on. We've identified 4 guiding questions, and in case of this webinar, we're going to focus on question number 1 and question number 3 in relation to the work that Peter and Sharon will share. CAS has created a number of web learning guides, and there's an upcoming one with Meredith Honig's work that also ties into some of the work around implementing competency 5. One of the learning guides is a synopsis of the final report of the research study. And another learning guide was based on Santiago Rincon Gallardo's session, where he really focused on supporting implementation of optimum learning for all students. And you can find that on our website. We'll send you the links later on if you haven't seen them. I'm thrilled that Peter Barron has agreed to share his story of practice with us today. Peter Barron is an educator with, I believe, 40 years of experience in the province of Alberta, approximately 8 to 10 years as a superintendent. Sorry if I have the number wrong. Peter, but has been a strong leader and a learner in our community at CAS for many years. His work in this area is based on his doctoral work as well, but highlights for me some of the competencies that are depicted on the left-hand side of this screen. As you know, the competencies are interdependent and interrelated, and so choosing some might not be the most effective, but for sure they relate in this area. I'll turn it over to you, Peter. Thank you very much for being with us, and you can take over the slides right now.
Okay, well, thank you, Val, for that kind introduction and emphasizing all my years of experience. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar. I entitled my section of this, When Good Intentions Aren't Good Enough, Decolonizing Leadership Praxis in the Pursuit of Equitable Student Outcomes. I landed on this title because my studies over the last 3 years have revealed, I think, an important truth, that good intentions aren't good enough. And, many laudable efforts by educators and school divisions are just not making the difference in student achievement for Indigenous students that we're all hoping for. In my school division, we have many things underway. We have a First Nations trustee, we have an elder council, we have FNMI liaisons in schools, we have Cree language instruction, land-based learning, all these things that we know to be good practice. However, these good intentions still are not moving the achievement needle, and transition to post-secondary rates still lag significantly behind non-Indigenous students in our province. And that's true in our school division, and as I said, it's also true provincially. So I started my learning journey as I was frustrated with this lack of progress, and wanted to make a difference. So where does the imperative come to do this? Well, the imperative comes from the TRC, right? Goal number 10 speaks to closing the achievement gap. Alberta Education Goal number 2 speaks to Indigenous student success. And perhaps more significantly, this is a social justice issue from my perspective. I'd also like to offer a land acknowledgement. I gratefully acknowledge that the land on which I live, learn, work, and play is Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. These lands are also the meeting grounds, gathering places, and traveling routes, and the ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux peoples. I acknowledge the elders and knowledge keepers who came before us and those who continue to enrich our lives. And I acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. And my commitment to reconciliation and decolonization is evident in my practice, in my commitment to reading, and to working with our neighboring 4 nations to build more positive relationships with them. Start with my positionality. So I think it's important that we recognize who we are. And I am a white, cisgender, uninvited male settler of European descent, raised in a colonial school system, and a practitioner in that same system. And I'm aware that these identities afford me certain advantages and perspectives that influence my understanding of the world. I acknowledge that my lived experiences contrast sharply with those of many Indigenous students and families. And so my implicit biases oblige me to listen earnestly, to learn, to unlearn, and to critically reflect. Currently, my role is as Superintendent CEO of Alberta Rural School Division, St. Paul. And I am, as Val mentioned already, ultimately responsible for ensuring quality school leadership, quality teaching, and optimum learning for all students in the school authority. And I stress this because the words equity and social justice are not words found in Alberta's language. So if you look in our documents, you look in our business plan, you won't see those words. I've searched for them. But we do have this line that it's for all students, not most of them. In terms of my influence, I have influence with the Board of Trustees in establishing and shaping their priorities and allocating resources. And I have some agency over divisional and school leadership teams. And I play a role in professional learning opportunities for all staff, but have direct influence over the strategic goals and professional learning of central and school leadership. Just a little of the context. St. Paul is a publicly funded complex K-12 organization. We have, we're small, but we are complex. We serve Catholic students, public students, First Nations, Mennonite, Hutterite, and home ed learners. And a third of our students identifies First Nations. And about 75% of First Nations students come from one of our neighboring reserves. 2/3 of Indigenous students hail from, well, as I just said, And so we have 19 school sites and 250 FTE and 357 support staff. I think it's important for me to talk a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings that are foundational to my presentation. And the first is critically informed social justice. So a critically informed social justice argues that societal power imbalances contribute to inequitable outcomes, so that it's not an equal playing field in society, that power is not evenly shared. And educators may be unaware of how institutional structures privilege some and disadvantage others, as these patterns are pervasive, invisible, and mostly unacknowledged. Second is social constructivism, which comes from critical theory, and it suggests that the meanings, understandings, and realities of the world are socially created or constructed. In other words, we derive meaning from our life experiences. And our views of reality often reflect the norms and biases of our society, inevitably perpetuating existing biases and assumptions. However, interacting with the environment can generate new mental models, and views of reality may be altered by changing discourse and including diverse and marginalized voices. People are born into a culture, however, the discourse also has impact on culture. And thirdly, systems thinking. Systems thinking is an approach to organizational change that emphasizes the interrelationship among its components rather than the components themselves. A system is an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. Many researchers consider it superior to conventional thinking, especially when considering chronic, complex social problems, arguing that conventional thinking may ironically exacerbate the social issue by creating unintended negative consequences. Conventional thinking focuses on symptoms, what's visible, rather than the underlying issues, and prioritizes short-term successes at the expense of longer-term solutions, looking for simple solutions to complex problems. So traditional approaches are predicated on linear thinking, and they do not take into account complex structures. So system thinking would say, for a complex issue, we need to understand the issue by peering beneath the surface and examining it further. From this perspective, leadership needs to address the current reality, but fail to appreciate why the problem exists in the first place. And we sort of want to do a little bit of voyage into that today. So technical problems have already been solved. There's a best practice. So if your engine light comes on, you take it to the dealership and they know exactly what to do to fix it. With complex problems, and it could be climate change, crime, poverty, homelessness, there is no single solution, and additional learning is required. And I'm arguing that for supporting Indigenous students, this is a complex issue, and more investigation, more learning is required. So system theory uses one way to look at it is like the typical iceberg, and we're very familiar with the iceberg metaphor. What we see on the top does not fully appreciate what's lying underneath. And so when we look at this iceberg, we talk about what is happening or what has been happening. And so what data is visible to everybody. And it's startling, right? The graduation rate of Indigenous students on reserve in our country is 50% lower than non-Indigenous students. And researcher Campbell in 2021 says that First Nation students overall achieve below the Canadian average in national and international assessments. And we know in Alberta that graduation rates for 22-23 was 80.7% of all students after 3 years. For Indigenous students, a very disheartening 57%. We also know that Indigenous youth are disproportionately represented in special education programs, less academically demanding courses, and they experience exclusionary discipline, suspensions, at significantly higher rates. So when we look at the tip of the iceberg, we're not actually looking at the problem, I would argue. We're looking at the symptoms of the problem. And so to understand the problem, we need to pose different questions. If we only look at the surface, then we may just respond superficially. So we look at high crime rates, for example, and let's say, well, what's the solution? Let's put more people in jail. and people and society does that, it ironically increases crime rates because it dips for a few years, then those people are released back into society. Nothing's really changed with them. The original cause of the crime has not been addressed. In fact, then crime increases. So we're obliged to look below the surface. So I want to do that with this topic. Peter Senge, you may be familiar with him, says today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. And I think that's certainly the case here. So let's look into the archaeology. Let's become archaeologists here and say, well, why is all this happening? Why is there so much gap in achievement? So if we go back to the Bagot report of 1844, which said Indigenous matters be centralized in the federal government and children be housed in boarding schools away from their families and their culture. And of course, this became the Indian Act of 1876, which really fundamentally entrenched colonialism and transformed the relationship of Indigenous people with non-Indigenous settlers. And the act was designed to protect First Nation people's rights while acknowledging the government's responsibilities. But in reality, the Canadian government had problematized Indigenous peoples and ushered in an age of structural and systemic racism. Residential schools and reserves were the Canadian government's solution to the Indian problem, resulting in policies for rapid and affordable assimilation. Structural racism and discrimination marginalized Indigenous peoples, precluding their full participation in mainstream society. And so many modern day injustices are traceable directly back to that act. So again, today's problem was yesterday's solution. So this problem and practice is being considered a direct descendant of the Indian Act and the acts of oppression against Indigenous peoples. And so settler colonialism resides in the heart, I believe, of this problem and practice. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about settler colonialism. First of all, it is ubiquitous in education. It is normalized and it operates invisibly. So we're not really aware of it, and it's all around us. Through a critical lens, colonialism dominates institution, and education is an institution that is a component of primarily invisible system that perpetuates inequities. Despite progress in programming and curricular approaches to realize equitable outcomes, there have been negligible improvements in well-being for Indigenous students. And researchers observe that despite modest increases in grad rates, systemic barriers persist and pathways for Indigenous people to overcome poverty are limited. And colonialism plays out in two ways in our belief in the education field. First of all, in our mindsets and mental models. So what is a mental model? Well, it's essentially a representation of how something works in your mind. It's a framework or a cognitive structure that helps you understand, interpret, and navigate the world around you. Mental models are based on your past experiences, knowledge, beliefs, assumptions, or even intuitive understanding. These are the tools we use to make sense of complex information, to solve problems, make decisions, and predict outcomes. People often use mental models without even realizing it, as they are ingrained in our thinking processes and shape how we perceive and interact with the world. Colonial mental models are evident in the achievement gap discourse among educators, which reveals deficit thinking, unconscious bias, and low expectations. So this discourse, the achievement gap discourse, refers to the assumptions and unquestioned beliefs that educators, parents, policymakers, and society engage in to explain the underachievement of racialized students or students living in poverty. It is a majoritarian narrative. In other words, it's throughout society. We all kind of say it and repeat it, and so it must be true, that provides explanations and solutions educators assume to be accurate. The prevailing public opinion, grounded in meritocracy, in other words, if you just work harder, everything will be, you will get what you deserve, is that students who are unsuccessful in school either lack ability or effort. So if you're not doing well in school, you're not trying hard enough, or you're not capable. And this discourse is responsible for the inequitable outcomes of students, their families, and so blame is basically put on the families and the culture rather than really looking at what are the structural and systemic issues that underpin inequity. Also, the discourse is teeming with myths that parents of marginalized students do not care about or value education. And blame for lack of success, as I said, is placed on students and their families. And we tend not to look inward for either responsibility or solutions. Deficit thinking, which is emerges from the achievement gap discourse is a belief that variations from the norm are to be constructed as deprived or deficient or less valuable. In other words, there's a compelling and accepted rationale among educators and policymakers to rationalize low achievement predicated on deficit thinking. Students often perform precisely how teachers believe they will perform. And this is very much the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which has been well established for many decades. And one symptom of deficit thinking is the tendency to focus on deficits and weaknesses rather than strengths and assets when assessing Indigenous students' academic abilities. An additional malignant outcome of deficit thinking includes the formation of negative stereotypes and biases, which can impact Indigenous students' sense of identity and self-esteem. And educators who operate from a deficit thinking paradigm attribute academic struggles to inability rather than their life experience. Unconscious bias, another element of the discourse, is the influence of unconscious bias. Implicit biases negatively impact students' achievement, identity, and sense of belonging, reducing their life chances. Some deficit thinkers interpret achievement gaps as inherent deficiencies in the students or their circumstances. And again, the education system is not viewed as culpable when Indigenous students underachieve. It also promotes low expectations, that somehow racialized students are inherently less capable and resulting in reduced expectations. And these low expectations lead to higher dropout rates and the downstreaming of Indigenous students into less challenging academic pathways, resulting in limited opportunities to attend post-secondary. So with that mindset, what do we end up doing? Well, we end up academic streaming, and there's evidence for that. Educators operating from deficit paradigm endorse the longstanding practice of streaming kids into academic pathways that are less challenging, ostensibly to meet their needs better. Canadian and Australian researchers reveal that teacher bias influences whether Indigenous students select academic streams, which directly govern the gateway to post-secondary study and future career opportunities. So specific pathways, as we well know, limit students' abilities to access post-secondary education. If students are in K&E, for example, then their post-secondary opportunities are limited indeed, but they do complete high school. So if the focus is on high school completion rates, but not on providing access to post-secondary, then have we really achieved what we need to achieve? The second area of practice is exclusionary discipline. Negative consequences of deficit thinking are also evident in leadership practice, such as disproportionately harsher school penalties. Racialized students are likelier to experience this kind of exclusionary discipline. And there's a ton of research that indicates that there is a pipeline from suspensions to prison. And research also indicates that if you are suspended 3 times in school, you have almost no chance of finishing high school. So let's take a peek back at the iceberg for a second. And we see that if we look at colonized leadership practices, and we look at what kind of mental models we end up having, and then how leads to certain practices. So the gaps, the achievement gap discourse I talked about, and of course the discipline and the streaming. So what do we do? Well, I think this quote by Lord's important. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which suggests that the colonial tools aren't necessarily going to decolonize. Now, Justice Sinclair said, famously said, education got us into this mess and education will get us out. And I think he's right, but I don't think it's education that got us into these problems will get us out. It's not the same kind of thinking that I believe that we need. So I think we need to change the way we think a little bit here. And Ann Lopez wrote in 2021, the process of decolonizing begins with self, and educators must begin with themselves. And I'm going to predicate what I'm about to say on that. So if colonization is at the root of the problem, then decolonization is the solution. That's a really big word, and it's a very broad term that encompasses many definitions. But what does it mean to decolonize? Well, it means to challenge and disrupt assumptions of colonial superiority, that Western way is just better than any other way. And it's a metaphoric journey of truth-seeking and abandoning colonial ideologies. Strobel in 97 said decolonizing work framed it into 3 stages: naming, reflection, and action. And this is based on Paulo Freire's work of a dialogic process. So what can we start to do differently? Well, if we look at personal transformation and we start asking questions, what has been happening? Why is this happening? What forces are at play? And what about our thinking allows this situation to persist? In other words, we need to examine this more deeply and examine ourselves. So there is a process that I think we need to go through personally, a process of unlearning, relearning, rereading, and reframing. And I think we need to reflect critically. I think we need to closely examine our own assumptions and our own biases. And if we have that self-awareness that comes from a deep understanding of how racial identity impacts leadership and the role of racism in sustaining systems of oppression. Through reflection, leaders can begin to unveil practices that disproportionately impact students, such as I've talked about, and start to reshape our worldviews and that guide our perceptions and our behaviors. And so we can be introduced to dilemmas, to disorienting dilemmas in PD activities that invite us to think critically. And as we gaze into the mirror and reflect upon our assumptions and mental models, we begin to understand how our mental models can be very limiting. So we can plan social justice conversations and have the efficacy of deepening participants' understanding of oppression and power imbalances, and develop critical consciousness, which is foundational for social transformation. Critical consciousness is the ability to understand and appreciate the social, political, and economic forces that shape the experiences of members of society. To be critically conscious is to recognize the power imbalances that foster privilege and also oppression. So I want to just take a look at one tool that you'll see here. Sorry, I'll just go back for a second. Different tools. So data analysis of trends. And so one thing I would invite all of you to do is to start to look at your data in a slightly different way. Start to look at, when you look at suspensions of students across the division, how many are students who are Indigenous? When you look at enrollment in K&E or low-level courses, how many of those students are Indigenous? And by unearthing that, start to reflect on that. Why is that? Why is it that way? Now, the ladder of inference is an interesting tool. And it's predicated on a transformative learning theory. Our ability to achieve the results we truly desire is hampered by our perceptions that our beliefs are the truth, right? So what we believe, we think is the truth. The truth is obvious. Everyone knows it. Our beliefs are based on real data, and the data we select, that's the real data. But we don't look at all the data, we select data. And from that data, we add meaning, and we make assumptions based on that data. We draw conclusions, and we adopt beliefs about the world, and then we take actions which tend to perpetuate and produce the same data that we originally examined. And I want to give you an example of how that can play out. Oh, sorry, before I do that, this quote here: we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So just a caution about our perceptions. So let's say we're looking at the data. So if on the left-hand side, number one, Indigenous students are not achieving at grade level. Okay, that's the data we look at. Indigenous students lack the ability or effort to perform academically. You could come to that meaning. Lack of academic success is due to inherent deficiencies. Indigenous students are not interested in education or post-secondary. Indigenous students and families are culturally deprived, and therefore Indigenous students are placed in lower academic streams such as knowledge and employability courses, which leads to lower achievement, which is the data we select, which perpetuates itself. And although this is based in research, I've also experienced that as a leader in terms of in discussions. So this is not, it's theoretically informed, but it also plays out every day. What else can you do? Well, you can do catalytic conversations. Catalytic conversations are invitations for people to reflect. And so, again, if you were to gather that data that I mentioned, gather the data about suspensions and share that with leadership and ask the questions, what does the data reveal? What story does it tell? How do you feel about those results? What's your visceral response to that? Why are we getting these results? Again, probing deeper to consider more carefully, why is this happening? And then what can we do differently? I just text the art of the focused conversation as a reference. I think there's I've made a hot link there. But there's also the art of focused conversation for schools, which I've also found very useful as a school leader. So that's another kind of approach you could use to help guide conversations. Another is to use case studies. And so here's an example from Drs. Briscoe and McIntosh, Dr. Briscoe is at Niagara University in Ontario. And that link will take you to a file, A Fractured School Community, Decolonizing Leaders Needed for Responsive Leadership. So in this case study, an imaginary school with some challenges with behavior and suspensions, and the principal handles it from a superficial perspective, which creates additional problems, and then is left with their teaching. It comes with a teaching guide to work with leadership to discuss terms like colonizing and decolonizing, and what other things are at play that perpetuated the issues that principal found. So we go back to the whole pyramid, and we see that if we have a decolonized mindset, so if we develop critical consciousness and have high expectations for students, and we're strength-based and we commit to act, if we have that in our mentality, then we can lead to decolonized practices. And we, I'm sure everybody's heard about two-eyed seeing, where we have an ethical space between our two different worldviews, and we get to meet and talk respectfully to each other about the different ways we see the world. We look at anti-racism practices. We look at restorative practices instead of exclusionary discipline. We look at culturally responsive pedagogy and land-based learning, culturally responsive leadership, and trauma-informed practices. So all those are wonderful things, and I think will take us in the direction we'd like to go. But I would also argue it's critically important that our mindsets are also in the same space, that we are critically conscious and not just going through the motions of this is what we ought to do. But I just want to do a couple of reflections on my learning journey, and think back to Gandhi's line, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." To me, it starts with us. Changing society, I think, begins with ourselves, and that's where we should begin. Challenge our own mental models, critically reflect on our own practices, and consider what are we missing. I like the expression being, knowing, doing. So a lot of the practices we're doing to help students would be considered like second order change, transformational change. But I think we need something deeper at the more epistemic level, at the level of being, that who we are as people, not just what we're doing, but who we are and what we believe and what we hold to be true. And challenging the popular discourses that we hear in society when the same deficit language is used over and over again. We need to be champions to challenge that. And I think every leader needs to start with their own positionality and agency. We should know what we believe, who we are, and why we believe what we believe. So knowing ourselves, I think, is the right departure point. And to adopt a critical perspective, and challenge meritocracy. Because you hear this often, that if people just work harder, that would be easier for them, not recognizing that the playing field is not flat and that there is privilege. And many people don't recognize that they have privilege. because they believe they worked hard all their life to get what they get. And so they worked hard, and somebody else can work hard too. So I think it's important to recognize that. And I think lastly, we don't do this work because it's a provincial mandate, because it's absolutely the right thing to do. There is a deep moral imperative to this work that I feel, that I want my leadership to feel and my staff to feel, and to take us on a journey to decolonize and to make a difference in the lives of the students that we're responsible for. So we look back to optimum learning for all students. We have to be making sure that we're trying harder for the kids who have a harder time. And we know some kids are fine. They've got family and lots of support and wealth and opportunities. But what about the 18–19% of students who are not graduating after 3 years? What are we doing to really make a difference for them? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing your personal story and journey. I've very taken back about the role that we have as system education leaders and coming to know ourselves in relation to our position and our leadership role in school authorities. Mental models, critical consciousness are things that will help us move things forward. But first of all, starting with ourselves is so crucial. Again, thank you for sharing your story of practice and how you are doing that with your own work in your own school system. We'll send you the slide deck to everyone, and it includes some suggested readings. As Peter mentioned, he's working on just completing his doctoral work, so there's a lot of readings here as well. But thank you for giving us the summary messaging as well. Just before we go on to Jamboard, are there any questions from the group that directed to Peter that you'd like to bring forward right now? Is there fresh in your mind? Hopefully that was enough wait time, and maybe we'll get into our groups. There's a small group today, but we thought we would still go into 2 breakout rooms. Peter will facilitate one, and I'll facilitate the other. And Rogan, would you mind showing the Jamboard? If everyone can take a picture of this, and then I'll put it in the slide deck so people in the chat, so people can get access to it. So I put the other thing in the chat was the case study that Peter shared. And again, we'll share the slides. In the chat right now is the Jamboard, the link to the Jamboard. And Rogan, if you wouldn't mind going to slide number 1 in the, thank you. The Jamboard, I think they're called slides. We've been focusing on the guiding questions from our webinars. Slide number 1 and slide number 2, if Rogan can go there, are based on the conversations from our first webinar around implementation of the professional practice standards. And then I made use of ChatGPT to compile everyone's comments and their summary response in terms of those 2 guiding questions. If we go to slide 3, so when you open the Jamboard, what we'd like to do in our breakout rooms, and we'll take approximately 15 minutes to do this work, is if you could explore that question, and then using the sticky note on the far left-hand side, if Rogan can drag his mouse over there, I think it's the 4th one down, where you can grab a sticky note and respond to that question, however you would choose to, and then we'll, Peter or I will facilitate the conversation in terms of what we're all thinking, and then we'll come back to the large group to share. So again, let's take 15 minutes because we'll be in smaller groups. There'll be more chance for you to either ask Peter or I questions and to respond, and Sharon will join one of the groups as well. So Rogan, put us into groups if that's okay, and put the timer on for approximately 15–20 minutes. Thank you, Rogan, for bringing us all back and allowing me to advance the slide or to show the slide deck from the Jamboard would even be more ideal. Welcome, Keith. The conversation was rich in my group. I know, Peter, it would be rich in your group. Lisa, could I call on you to bring forward your comments or any other comments from our group conversation just as a way to share? Would that be possible, Lisa?
I will definitely be able to share what I shared. Unfortunately, I was on the phone for another piece of it. I highlighted some of our successes, and one of the areas that we're looking at is using Jordan's principle to create success. So this year and last year, we actually had a teacher who was dedicated to tracking students from grade 9 to grade 12 to see what their success rate was in the core courses. And their responsibility was to support that student with the teachers in planning and studying and completing assignments. And one of the students shared that it was the first time they've ever passed core courses. And some of the kids now are actually shifting their assignment timetable to ensure they have access to this teacher during their flex blocks, knowing that that's a support system for them. Do you want me to share other pieces, Val, or is that good?
No, that's
Okay.
great. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Lori or Carolyn, would you interested in sharing your work? What was telling in our group, if I can share on behalf of the group, is that everyone was very transparent and honest about the need to move the needle more, so to speak, or that practices that were working and having success, that they wanted to expand that work, or not expand that work, to make it more meaningful and more effective. So the message that you shared, Peter, came through for sure in the group's conversation. Peter, over to you and your group to share.
Thank you. Yeah. So I don't know if I've certainly invite any individuals to jump in as well, but we talked about the importance of planning and making intentionality around this topic and ensuring that there's a like accountability pieces in the sense of that how do we measure if our plans are having an impact and getting back to having although we're not doing individual research, but be willing to say what would we accept as evidence that that we're seeing achievement go up. We talked about removing barriers to authentic learning and ensuring that the school experience, we didn't say the word decolonized, but is decolonized, so that the practices at the school are inviting to our Indigenous learners, that they see themselves in the school. And foundational, of course, to all the TQS, LQS, and SLQS, the first is always relationships. And so building relationships with families and students and communities is critical work in moving this forward. Professional learning we talked about as being vital, and I can't remember who Carmen talked about. Are you the zone chair, Carmen? I can't remember, but you said has some responsibility and could to maybe bring in some additional things at the last meeting. But this needs to be more discourse, and it has a discourse provincially, but I think it could be much stronger. I think it could be a stronger focus. Myself, I'd invite anybody else to jump in. Shay, Carol, anyone if I missed something. No, guess not.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to everyone that contributed. The Jamboard is open. The value add of hearing your views of what you've contributed and the work that you're doing in your system is so essential to share with other cast members as well. So please feel free to add anything more here. Rogan, can you switch us back to the slides, please? That would be fantastic. Thank you. Thanks again to everyone for sharing. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Sharon Friesen. Sharon was the principal lead researcher on the professional practice standards, and implementing Alberta's professional practice standards was a grant that was contributed or delivered to all of the post-secondary universities identified at the bottom of this slide. And they worked together on a 4-year longitudinal study that included things that are represented on the screen: a literature review, division survey reports, study reports, case studies reports, and resulted in one final report, which I find very exciting to read and really important in terms of our work as system education leaders. We've asked Sharon to come today to share her expertise around the area of implementation, which was one strong theme in the report. And Sharon is a professor at the University of Calgary in the Workland School of Education, and has had a great influence in work across the province and around the world in terms of supporting our work in K-12 education. Sharon, over to you now, and we'll let you control the slides.
Thank you. I just needed to unmute myself here, and then there we go. I will try my best to stay within the 10 minutes that this part of the presentation was allotted. And so I wanted to just say a little bit about the study itself. The study drew upon implementation science, which is a science that really looks at how organizations undertake the implementation of anything. And so within this study, what Peter was talking about was competency 5 would be an implementation within an implementation. And so the same kind of principles would still hold, whether it was the larger professional practice standard, or if you were taking on as a division an aspect of that, such as competency 5. And so one of the pieces that you first need to pay attention to, and the leaders, system leaders in our study really attended to, was the fidelity of use of the professional practice standards. So every one of them understood that the practice standards needed to be operationalized, so they were teachable, learnable, doable, and accessible. And so that within practice, so that they didn't stay at the level of this is a good idea for someday and never get around to it. So recognizing that implementation was a process and it required a significant amount of work. It's not an event. So to be successful, the implementation efforts required a very clear description of what was to be implemented, by whom, when, where, how. And so there had to be an underpinning of values that were put on the table, principles that underlie the entire implementation that would guide the decisions, and also promote consistency, integrity, and sustainable effort across the entire organization. They needed a clear description of the features that must be present to say within any school or any classroom or at a division office, what is optimum learning? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What do we observe in practice? What would be the leadership practices? What would be the teaching practices that would provide evidence that it is actually there? And one of the things that we found initially is that school divisions had a lot of activity going on, but they weren't actually assessing towards the outcome, which is optimum learning for all. And so attending to what the outcome is and looking at evidence based on that and putting forward a trajectory became really important. Otherwise, you invest in a whole lot of activity, but it may or may not yield any type of impact towards the final outcome that you're attempting to achieve. The third thing that is needed for the high fidelity of any implementation is really documenting kind of the core activities that need to be implemented in order to make this particular, the professional practice standards in this sense, in this area, teachable, learnable, and doable in practice, and promote consistency across the entire school authority. And then the last item that needs to be in place in each one is a practical assessment of the performance of those involved in the implementation. And so that practical assessment is a performance assessment that's formative, that is directly related to previously identified goals, and it's done repeatedly throughout the entire implementation so that evidence is being collected towards that agreed upon outcome. And so it answers 3 really simple questions. Are you doing what you intended to do? How do you know? And does it make a difference? Just, whoops. Hang on. I'll try again to advance that one. There we go. Whoop. Tried it too hard, pressed it too hard. So within the implementation, and you'll see the core activities in order to achieve fidelity of your implementation. There are 3 major areas, and Peter spoke about this, but there needs to be professional learning for all. And the most successful school authorities that we worked with had professional learning in a networked way for their system leaders. They did for their principals, and they did for their teachers. So the teachers set goals based on the TQS, the school leaders set goals based on the LQS, and the system leaders set goals based on the SLQS. And then they worked with each other in a networked way, coming together every month using evidence that was put forward in terms of how they were doing. Were they doing what they intended to do? How did the evidence show that they knew and were making a positive difference? In terms of the organizational drivers that also need to be put into place at exactly the same time, because this is a complex, you're working with a complex model, are systems interventions. So some long-term system interventions that you're going to be putting into place. And so that's going to sustain your initiative in the long run, really attending to that multi-level alignment with it. That facilitative administration are using evidence at the system level, but at the classroom level and at the school level as well, to make changes to structures, to policies, to funding allocations, and to roles. And the whole purpose of that is to remove and reduce as much as you can, sometimes you can't remove, but reduce the barriers to the implementation. And then, and in our particular study, COVID hit for 2.5 years of the study. And one of the things that we noticed in terms of reducing the barriers, school divisions sometimes took over the entire role of reporting for the schools in order to reduce the barriers to implementation, allowing the schools and the teachers to focus on providing optimum learning experiences. So, you know, that's just one example, but there is a multitude of ones that we found in terms of connectivity for some of the students during that time. That system level, in terms of that, took over that responsibility, and that decision support data systems so that the evidence and data drive the decision making. In terms of the leadership drivers, there's 2 forms of leadership that are required. One of them, in a technical form, are ones that, you know, and Peter talked about that. These are of known entities. You know, if somebody, a principal leaves for whatever reason, it's known how you will hire and replace them. But adaptive leadership is needed, for example, exactly what Peter said, in competency 5. These are where unknown issues and and then working to address the unknown issues on there. But all three of them have to work together. In the most successful groups, the leader, the superintendent and all the system leaders worked with every single one of these drivers and had them all in play at the same time, and were working with them in a continuous fashion throughout their school divisions. And they came together, teachers came together, and reported teachers came together with principals and their admin teams. The whole system worked together. So an example, in one of the schools, they were doing assessments, but the principal and their system leader realized that the teachers weren't understanding had a common understanding about what the assessments meant that the district had put out. And so there was a shift that happened so that all students were assessed fairly and accurately. And, so those are types of decisions that needed to be made in there, but the whole entire system then went into supporting that. And the system leaders then said, if that's happening in this school, I wonder if it's happening in other schools. So to be able to create that system alignment, so you don't end up in a place where it's consistently the marginalized students that are bearing the brunt of poor assessment techniques. And then in terms of the stages of implementation, then it's really important. And in the report, we've put in this diagram. We've adapted it. What we've used are terms that we've also used and taken from some of the literature, but then taken it and worked through the stages exactly so they correspond. But you go through an awareness and exploration, initiating an early adoption, then adapting and enacting, where you're using data, new data collections techniques to be able to bring to the problems that are working, but you're working on integrating improvement cycles into that new practice and always committing to a continuous growth. And then sustaining and embedding. And what we found is that most leaders in Alberta were at the adapting and enacting space with the professional practice standards, and in some areas they were in the sustaining and embedding area, and then moving to scaling and extending. But because it's not linear, it doesn't just flow like that. Something comes up like COVID, and all of a sudden you thought you were at adapting, and now you're back at initiating because you were throwing the curveball, and now you've got to become familiar with new expectations. So it has an ebb and flow to it, and it's a better way to look at things rather than looking at them as an implementation gap. It's not there. Context changes. And so what you'll find is if you come into different stages then of the implementation process, what's important to remember that when you're at that stage, the work that you need to do is the work that falls underneath that. And we've tried to document that, or we documented it based on 4 years of research from this study. And so with that, Val, I'll turn it back to you. Whoops, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. I really appreciate the sharing that you did and the findings that you had from the final report that are represented in this slide. The merged findings, which I think were very unique in terms of how you combined all of the different types of research approaches and came up with these main messages. Did you want to share anything about this slide at all, or?
No, it's just that one of the things that you would find is exactly what I've discussed. We found that the ways that the leaders went implementing the standards was in an ongoing and iterative way. Those that were really successful, there were a couple that said, well, I gave the standard and the teaching quality professional standard to the teachers, and they're all professional, so I just left it with them. And so we do have some school divisions that did that, a few, not very many. You know, it was interesting because then at the end of the study, they came back to me and said, Sharon, we should have listened to you in the beginning. You know what? That didn't work at all. And so, you know, which is a good space of recognition by the leader. I really appreciated their honesty. But they also acknowledge they've got some work to do because they now have to make up and try to get alignment across the entire system where there wasn't before, and some coherence that's built into a system. So both the multi-level alignment, but also coherence at the same time. And I think the other thing that became really important for the leaders, the system leaders, it was really important to make connections and relationships and have those with external organizations and systems, because they provided the support and sustaining the implementation of the standards throughout the COVID years and beyond the 4 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sharon, for sharing your expertise. One thing that I'd like to bring forward is frequently in our education plans and even our AERRs, we reflect on professional learning as an intervention to create the change that we're imagining that we would like to see. And many of the findings do focus on professional learning. But what I think is very, very strong about the report is it also highlights the importance of implementation. When Alberta leaders and stakeholders got together to develop the guide to support implementation of the essential conditions, what was becoming evident in the province was that the intervention was seen as professional learning. And if we provide professional learning in an area, we'll have solved the problem. And it came to be that you needed more than just professional learning. You needed to create that culture of learning. And as Sharon highlighted, you needed all those drivers, professional learning being one of them, the system leaders role, the leadership driver, as well as the organizational drivers that help put all the pieces together. In the essential conditions document, which is one of the most downloaded documents on the CAS website, you can see the different conditions that are represented by the blue dots there, and those are mentioned in much of the final report. When the essential conditions document was created, we didn't have the luxury of seeing all the new research within the last 10 years around implementation science. That research has been around for many years, but it's been compiled nicely through some of the images that Sharon shared. And again, what is unique from the final report is the researchers have taken that research and applied it to our own context. So we're looking forward to learning more about that and enhancing the work of the essential conditions. But we'll send you all of those links as well. Just before we conclude, would like to give final words to any final sentence, Sharon, that you would like to share. Then I'll turn it over to Peter, and then I'll thank everyone. Sharon, one final sentence or two?
Yeah, I think Ed, you had asked me a really interesting question, which I had I've continued to think about, right?
Please.
Since you asked it.
Thank you.
You said, so why should the implementation of the professional practice standards continue? After all, it was a 2018 government document. And I'd say, yep, that is true. However, the reason it should continue is because school divisions, and it's been found globally, that school divisions that focus and have learning that's defined as achievement, engagement, and well-being for all, which is what our document does, have much stronger student learning outcomes than districts that don't. And so the standards play a really, really important role on positive teaching quality and stating teaching quality, particularly when districts hire from that, assess students or teaching from that, provide supervision based on that, and also in terms of student learning. I think the other thing is they guide the professional learning of the school division. And the third thing that I came up with why should do that is it provides consistency across the districts and a consistent approach to leadership across Alberta and help in maintaining that. And for me, the fourth reason why is because those standards, the leadership standards and the superintendent leadership standard were created by the professionals in this province to say, what do we as leaders want to be accountable to each other as standards within this province to which we practice towards.
Thank you, Sharon. Peter, same question, and thank you for reminding us of the question, Sharon. Most important question. Why, as system education leaders, should we pay attention to the standards, including Competency 5, and a summary statement from your role as a chief superintendent?
Sure. Thank you, Val. So we are fortunate in Alberta that we have this standard, these documents that are aligned, the TQS to the SLQS with very similar language. And I think that's the great guiding documents for us. But guiding documents stay on the shelf unless we engage with the text, unless we spend time with our staff talking about it and in helping to interpret and understand it. And so those processes, those dialogic processes are essential, I believe, to making them come to life. And, you know, it's not simply, I don't think policy ever changed anybody's heart. I don't know if that, but we need policies in place to guide the discussion and to say what is the standard we're trying to reach. In this particular work around with Indigenous kids, there's complexity to this that we need to consider, and there isn't a single solution. And so we need to look inward a little bit to make sure we understand ourselves and our perspectives and our own role in how we react. You know, I read research that said that when a teacher has low expectations of a student, they do not wait as long for an answer, right? This has been marked. They spend longer with a student they believe has more potential. And so we, in very small ways and very significant ways, tell students what they're capable of. We communicate that to them in a variety of ways. And if we start to pay attention to that in ourselves and talk about it, then I believe that's the first real step to making improvements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to everyone that was engaged today. Really appreciate your involvement in the breakout rooms, your contributions to the JAM board. Again, accolades to Peter and Sharon for sharing their expertise. Anybody else, final comments before we sign off and continue on with our day? Thank you again to everyone. Have a great day of learning, and we'll definitely follow up from Cass with some links to the slide decks and some other materials as well. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you soon.